Hi everybody, my name's Professor Ben Bennet. I'm Deputy Director of the Natural Resources Institute, which is at the University of Greenwich in the UK, and I've been asked today to talk to you for a bit to try to introduce or answer the question, why doesn't inter-regional trade work in Africa? Why doesn't Africa feed itself? So that's the basic question that I'll address in the next 10 to 15 minutes. The desire is there very strongly to boost inter-African trade and encourage agricultural trade between African countries. And this commitment was made by all of the heads of state of the African Union and all of the countries in Africa. And it's written in stone as Article 5 of the Malabo Declaration of 2014. And this declaration commits member states to boosting inter-Africa trade in agricultural commodities and services. Very impressively, it wants to triple by the year 2025, but as we'll see, we're tripling from a somewhat low base. And it wants to create policies and institutions and conditions, support systems to make that work. The desire is certainly there. The reality up until recently has been rather thin on the ground. So you often hear African leaders talking about Africa or bits of African nations as the national breadbasket or the breadbasket of Africa. But actually, at the moment, in recent years, as a continent, Africa is importing substantially more food than it exports. So it's not self-sufficient, though you might argue whether self-sufficiency makes a lot of sense. They export lots of other good things, which they can use the money to buy food. But the performance of African agriculture in terms of exports and imports has not been very good. And the share of global agricultural exports from Africa has been pretty consistently stuck at around 4%. This data only goes up to 2012, so it's a little bit old. And that's one of the challenges you face looking at trade in African agriculture, is that the data is often not very good. So while it might have gone up a little bit more in recent years, this proportion is really very small indeed. So what's the problem? African exports are concentrated on a limited number of traditional commodities. African still exports largely primary goods for processing outside, and it tends to import staple goods for food security. So you can see in these diagrams here that the top African exports by value are cocoa, still, coffee, cotton, and citrus from the agricultural sector. So these have not changed decade on decade for really a very long time, except perhaps with the increase in the price of cocoa. But even so, most of these commodities are processed, and the high portion of the value is added outside Africa, not within it. That's really not a great situation that is still there. In terms of imports, you can see, Africa is a country that produces many of these products, is still importing rice, sugar, maize, milk and cream, meat, fish, and vegetable oil. So exporting relatively high value industrial food commodities, and importing low value commodities that are produced cheaply elsewhere. So how does Africa compare with others? You might say, well, other regions have this sort of problem as well. Well, if you look at this chart here, you can see that the proportion of inter-regional trade, and I put a box around Africa so you can compare it with Europe, for example, where inter-regional trade is a massive proportion of total trade, whereas in Africa it's kind of stuck around the 20% mark. So in sum, what are the problems, or what does the data show us? So Africa is massively export dependent, but it's stuff going out of Africa and not traded between African countries. The share of exports from Africa to the rest of the world range from 80 to 90% between 2000 and 2017. And the only other region with a higher dependency in the world is Oceania. Inter-African trade lags behind all other regions of the world. Inter-African exports 16.6% of total exports in 2017, compared with 68% in Europe. Inter-African trade, defined as the average of inter-African exports and imports, was around 2% during the period of 2015 to 17. Whereas you can see from these figures in Europe it was 67%. The 10 leading intra-African exporters, well, the leading one is Eswatini, which is surrounded by South Africa, so it has to export. Everything that goes out has to be exported, so its percentage is always going to be hard. Namibia, a huge country with a small population, quite successful at exporting fish and a bit of meat byproduct into the region. Zimbabwe, Uganda, Togo, Djibouti, also meat, Lesotho, Kenya, Malawi. Not a very, it's when you get to Malawi, you're already down to 38%. In a landlocked country, it's rather small. The 10 countries with the lowest share, Chad, almost negligible. Some big countries in here. Angola, 3.9%, very small indeed. I've included this picture of a bit of a problem in Lagos harbour when it rains. If you've ever been to Lagos, this is what the harbour road looks like when it rains. It grinds to a halt. So what are countries trying to do about this? So the theory is that you should have trade agreements and you should reduce the friction in trade. So there's an effort to make an African regional continental free trade area. 22 countries have ratified this. That's the yellow countries on this map. 52 have signed the preliminary agreement. The Nigerians have decided not to sign either of these agreements, and as you can see from the graph at the bottom, the Nigerians are the single most important countries. It's very important that they are engaged with at some point. Underlying this is a huge web of different trade agreements and free trade agreements, some of which conflict with each other. So I use as an example here the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a serial joiner of free trade agreements, and this kind of tartan map that you see here shows you the 14 different regional trade agreements that DRC has joined and was in 2018. Each of these trade agreements got separate headquarters and standards and tariffs, and it's enormously complicated and somewhat pointless, as we shall see that DRC doesn't trade very much with its neighbours in any formal sense of the word. Quite a lot informally, but not much formally. And then some of these trade agreements that DRC has also overlapped by international agreements, which are generated by all sorts of pressures. Traditional colonial relationships in some cases, development aid plans such as economic partnership agreements, and then this bottom right-hand map of Africa here with the patchwork on it shows you the existing regional economic communities, RECs as they are called, and the overlapping web of different RECs. It's somewhat messy, shall we say. So, is regional integration working? One of the main reasons for regional integration is to encourage trade between countries. So this data from the African Trade Monitor shows you some of the problems, and I've highlighted DRC because we saw that they're a member of all of those different trade agreements. Have their exports increased? Agricultural exports increased? Share of agricultural trade increased? Well, no, it hasn't. It stayed the same. actually, some countries are now exporting less than they exported regionally before, and Zimbabwe is a good example of that. In the 90s, Zimbabwe had a very substantial export trade in agricultural commodities and meat byproducts and other grains, and it's actually heading in the wrong direction, not the right direction. So, has regional integration worked again? Tariffs have been reduced or been taken down by this regional integration, but the problem is that the cost to export is still high. So this graph here kind of illustrates that really well. So you can see that the lines are the tariffs, which have been slowly negotiated down bit by bit. I won't bore you with the difference between applied tariffs and MFN tariffs, but the measures of non-tariff barriers, the cost to export to someone who's moving products across borders out of the continent or between countries, this has gone up at the same time as tariff barriers have gone down. So what has been given with one hand has been taken away with another. So why is it important to have inter-African trade? Well, the theory suggests that that if you can reduce the friction from trade and allow goods to pass between countries, it allows competitive and comparative advantage to come to the fore, and for people to invest and focus on those commodities and products that they have a real advantage in, and then to get scale economies and to move these products across borders to bigger and bigger markets. Africa as a whole is a potential massive market if you could reach all of it. So the theory also goes that this would improve the food balance and encourage self-sufficiency and resilience, because there will be more food locally across different regions and the different geographies and climates to allow some forms of resilience against shock. What stops trade between African states? Well, the key reason that people don't trade traditionally has been tariffs. These are taxes that people pay to move a product from one country to another, and they used to form a really important source of income for countries across Africa. There's been a big effort in recent decades to improve the way that income's collected. So you find value-added tax programs, for example, successfully being implemented. So they're not so dependent on tariffs. So tariffs have slowly gone down. Tariffs are also used to protect domestic industries, to stop goods flooding in from other countries, to allow domestic industries to flourish without non-competitive practices, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for nefarious reasons. The other big thing that stops trade are non-tariff barriers. So these are things like taxes and charges, quality and safety standards, and sometimes called technical issues, import bans, customs and trade facilitation measures, just basically bureaucracy and paperwork and just things that make it very difficult. There's an enormous web of different rules across Africa. So one of these is what's called rules of origin. That's rules that prevent you moving things across a border and claiming that they came from the country that you moved it from when they actually didn't. Very complicated, very arcane, very hard to prove, and sometimes simply stop trade. The absence of infrastructure, ports, roads, railways, policies, price controls and taxes, investment rules, different labour and landlords laws in different countries. In the agricultural sector, something as simple as a national GMO policy can prevent trade, and did famously in 2002 when Zambia denied access to its market for South African maize because they didn't, even though it had been milled, because they didn't have a domestic GMO law that could prevent it. So they just denied it access. Very high transport costs. The cost of containers in Africa is the highest in the world. Dangerous and difficult borders, land borders across Africa, on the whole, not fun places to be. Can be chaotic, dangerous, not good at night. Inefficiencies in distribution, anti-competitive activities, and so on and so on. There are a huge range of different trade barriers going on. So an example you might find, there's been quite a lot of recent research. ODI have done a good report on non-tariff barriers in the East African community. Supposed to be a free trade community. Essentially all trade is supposed to be without tax, tariff or non-tariff barriers. Well, ODI found delays to borders, shortage of weigh bridges, very important for trucks. So at each border you had to queue for hours and hours to get your truck weighed so you could pay a levy, official and unofficial bribes and fines, different road use fees, and simply poor roads, particularly in rainy seasons, making transits very, very poor. ODI estimated that elimination of all non-tariff barriers in EAC could reduce regional poverty by 0.5%. Doesn't sound like very much, but regional poverty is a very hard thing to address. This could tackle it directly. Another example is the absence of any consumer agency, the ability of consumers to take any control over the goods that they receive. So the absence of standards and metrology sounds like a very arcane thing, but if you don't have a weighing scale that works, or a measure that you're sure that measure is consistent, it does make all aspects of agricultural trade very difficult, and the person that ends up paying for this, or the people that end up paying for this, tend to be the consumers at the end of the day. So what initiatives might help? Improve national policies, increase transparency, systems that increase transparency and reduce transaction costs, better coordination, measures that increase traceability and trust, more and better data. Trade is driven by data and transparency of data, and improved evidence of benefits. If people realized how much the economy could gain by improvement in trade, maybe they'd make more effort to change the laws and the policies. There are a lot of opportunities, and I just give you a few here. There are a lot of trucks moving around Africa that go somewhere with a product in it and come back empty. I discovered in the late 90s an example of this with trucks taking goods from South Africa up to Angola that were going back empty when the Angolans had counter-seasonal onions. It's a picture of people unloading onions on the right-hand side. Cargo space on flights, scale economies, using byproducts. So byproducts tend to be dumped because they're expensive to move from A to B in trucks. So there are opportunities to turn these byproducts into items of value. There are different commodities that have specific, which could be the focus of specific programs in trade within Africa. And in particular, I focus on meat and fish. There's a fishery or aquaculture boom going on in Africa. So trade in fish and fish products could be very interesting. And the same applies to meat, where you've got people interested and getting more income and living in cities are interested to buy meat and meat products, but they are importing them from Argentina and India, when there's a surplus of meat in other countries around Africa. There's a huge opportunity there. It's just two examples. High value agricultural products make life easier than low value ones to get leverage and to get started. What would the benefits of greater interregional trade be? Product and market diversification, domestic value addition, improve resource management, scale benefits, investment. There are so many benefits are in inter-African trade. I could talk about them for an hour, but I won't. I think that's enough for that. That was just a brief and very rapid run through why Africa has not got more inter-African trade in agricultural commodities and what we could do about it. Thank you very much.